Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Doughty Street Chambers seminar on disability and the COVID-19 pandemic. My name's Jamie Burton. I'm head of the Community Care and Health team at Doughty Street, and I'm delighted today to be joined by two colleagues who will be talking to you. First is Alice Irving, a practitioner in public law and disabled people's rights, who also, as I understand it, has a doctorate in philosophy. So she'll be able to give you a very intriguing and in-depth insight into some of the more philosophical matters that COVID-19 has given rise to, particularly in the context of disabled people's rights. And we also have Dr. Oliver Lewis, a well-known practitioner in the field of disabled people's rights, with a particular expertise in international law and international legal principles, and indeed has a strong court of protection practice, which also deals with disabled people's rights. None of you will need reminding that COVID-19 has, of course, generated enormous amounts of anxiety and distress, not only for everybody effectively in society, but specifically for those who suffer pre-existing disadvantage and prejudice. And disabled people are chief amongst that group. We've seen from recent government figures that unfortunately the mortality rates, the rates of illness, and indeed the rates of decline in well-being are particularly and disproportionately adversely affecting disabled people. At the same time, we've seen government policy and legal responses which don't necessarily seem to match the gravity of the impact on disabled people. We've seen, of course, failures around provision of PPE and other services to care homes. We've seen reams and reams of guidance that hasn't been specifically geared towards the needs of disabled people if it hasn't directly contradicted their rights. And we've seen other measures, such as the steps taken to water down the provisions of the Care Act during the COVID-19 pandemic, all of which have suggested that the government's response to COVID hasn't been as well tailored, to put it mildly, to the needs of disabled people as it could have been. However, on the other hand, we've also seen a very robust and effective response from disabled people and their activists. And it's with that in mind that I'm particularly delighted that we do have Oliver and Alice here today to tell us both a bit about what has already taken place in terms of asserting and defending the rights of disabled people, perhaps more particularly, however, what might be happening in the future and what challenges lie ahead, either in the context of a vaccine or indeed in terms of the current guidance in relation to people visiting care homes. Just a couple of matters of housekeeping before we hear first from Alice. For those of you who are new to Zoom and webinars of this kind, you'll notice that your mics are muted and your videos are off. This is a pre-setting just to avoid any interference for our speakers. But if you do have any questions or points you want to raise, please do use the Q&A function rather than the hands up function on the Zoom app. We will collate those questions as the seminar develops, and then they will be routed to the speakers at the end. Both speakers are going to talk for about 20-25 minutes, and then therefore there'll be ample opportunity for questions after that. And the final point from me is just to remind you that this session is being recorded, and there will be a copy of the slides and the recording available on the Doughty Street website after today. So after that, it just falls to me to introduce our first speaker, Alice Irving.
Thanks very much, Jamie. I'm very pleased to be here. I'm going to try to share my screen, so we'll take the first technical step and see if I'm successful. Excellent, I think that should be working just fine now. I can't promise any particular philosophical insight, so you may have been misled there by Jamie, but what I'm going to cover today in this presentation is to look a little at the November report from Public Health England that looked specifically at mortality during the pandemics for individuals with learning disabilities, and then how that feeds into, or hasn't fed into, as the case may be, the vaccination prioritization framework, which is developing in the context of that vaccination being rolled out very soon. The backdrop to all of this is a campaign that I was involved in as a member of the legal team called Every Death Counts. So you may have noted, if you have an interest in the area of the rights of people with disabilities, that at the beginning of the pandemic, when we started getting daily reporting of mortality rates, infection rates, and so on, that there was no breakdown of that data in relation to individuals with learning disabilities and or autism spectrum disorders. So we quite promptly had a breakdown in relation to age, sex, and ethnicity. And it was quite apparent from early on that there were disparate impact on certain groups. So men more adversely affected, older cohorts more affected, and obviously BAME individuals disproportionately affected. But we weren't seeing anything about people with learning disabilities or people with disabilities generally coming through. There was real concern about this. So there were a group of activists that came together and they crowdfunded a campaign called Every Death Counts. And essentially, what that campaign did was to send a number of pre-action protocol letters to key stakeholders, including the UK Statistics Agency and Public Health England, to query and to challenge the fact that there wasn't any data available. And the context for this, as I'm sure you're aware, is that we already know that people with learning disabilities tend to die younger and also have experienced discrimination and difficulty in accessing healthcare even during normal times. So there was obvious and well-founded concern that there would also be difficulties experienced in the context of the pandemic, and that this population might be particularly vulnerable. What followed in response to those letters was a sort of slow increase in the data that was being made available by Public Health England and other bodies. And all of that has culminated most recently in the most comprehensive report we have to date, which was published in November, and it's there at the bottom of the slide, which looks specifically at the deaths of people identified as having learning disabilities, although it doesn't extend to cover those with autism spectrum disorders, and obviously it doesn't cover people with disabilities more generally. So it is a particular snapshot. In terms of the key findings, they're both shocking and perhaps to be expected. So I'll explain a little bit more in a second about what I mean about the figures being adjusted, and also that there is sort of different numbers there. But the overarching key finding was that the rate of death from COVID-19, or from potentially sort of suspected to be COVID-19 of people with learning disabilities, was 4 to 6 times that of the general population overall, which is it's a fairly staggering figure. In terms of the adjustments that were made to reach that, and why we've got 4 to 6 rather than a firm number, first of all, I'm going to talk a little bit about the underlying data sets and their deficiencies in a second. But basically, there's a level of estimate involved here, because none of the data sets available are perfect. And but because of that, there's a need to make sort of some estimates and to make adjustments for acknowledged underreporting. And then the figures are standardized as well for age and sex to recognize the fact that relative to the general population, there's a difference of distribution in age and sex. And there are also multiple data sets relied on underpinning these findings, none of which are complete. And so depending on which data set you look to, you find this figure of either 4 times the death rate of the general population or 6 times that of the general population. I think what's even more striking, the report from Public Health England does break down deaths by different kind of subcategories, so age range, sex, ethnicity, setting, although there are significant limitations on the data. But the most striking of those breakdowns, I think, relates to age range. So you see here that not only is overall this cohort particularly vulnerable to mortality from COVID-19, but this is across all age ranges. And in fact, for someone who's 18 to 34 years old and has a learning disability, they're 30 times more likely to die from COVID than someone in the general population in that age range. And so you see that right across those age ranges, there's significant vulnerability. Perhaps that's most readily illustrated with this figure from the Public Health England report. So the bars that we have on the right there show in black the learning disabilities, that deaths of people per 100,000 population for learning disabilities as notified. The white bar on top as adjusted for under notification, which again, I'll explain a little bit more. But that whole bar on the right is the final figure for deaths per 100,000 of the population for people with learning disabilities. And then the grey on the left is the general population. And I think really what's striking is that when we tend to think about vulnerable groups, a lot of the time this is done in relation to age. And if you compare the height of those various bars, you can see quite clearly that in relation to the group of people with learning disabilities, that for everybody who's over 35 and upwards, they are more vulnerable, so the bar's higher, than every other group of the general population except for the 75 plus. So someone who's 35 to 44 and has a learning disability is more vulnerable to mortality from COVID than, say, someone who's 65 to 74 in the general population. And why that's significant, I'll come to in due course when I come to speak about how they're talking about prioritising the rollout of the vaccination, which has just been approved for use in the UK. So I've sort of hinted at the fact that there are key limitations. And again, I think that this is really critical when we come to talk about vaccination rollout and the kind of rationale offered by the government for the prioritisation that's been mooted. So the first thing to note is that a lot of the early data coming out in terms of daily death rates for COVID, so that reported by the official Office of National Statistics that we were seeing on a daily basis being updated on the TV when we still had those lovely press briefings. A lot of those were based on death certificates. That was sort of the core data that was initially available. And the current format of the death certificate doesn't require any information to be recorded as to whether somebody has a learning disability, or autism spectrum disorder. And so we've immediately got a key source of information that's reliably and readily available to allow for a breakdown of figures in relation to sort of age, sex, ethnicity that isn't available in relation to people with disabilities. And that would require legislative change for that to be improved. The three sources of data that were used for the Public Health England report that I've just sort of set out some key findings from also have key limitations. So I'll go through these briefly. I apologise that this might seem a bit dry, but I do think that this is incredibly significant when we start thinking about the disadvantage suffered by this cohort and the inability of the government to respond adequately, partly being underpinned by pre-existing problems with access to data. So the first of those key groups or key sources of data is the Care Quality Commission publications, publishes and records notifications of death. So if somebody dies in the context of a care setting, which is regulated by the Care Quality Commission, then there is an obligation on that setting to provide a notification of death to CQC. However, while the form that is used to make that notification includes a box where you can state whether somebody has a learning disability or not, it's not mandatory to fill out that aspect of the form. And so there are two limitations that are really important with this source of data. First is obviously it's only in relation to regulated care settings that you're going to be getting any figures at all. And secondly, not all of those forms are going to be completely filled out in relation to whether or not somebody has a learning disability. The second source of data used was one that was set up specifically in response to the COVID pandemic, and this is the CPNS, the COVID-19 Patient Notification System. This reports deaths in hospitals. So again, we're missing out on every other setting, so anybody dying in the community. And in that context, 25% of responses received said it was unknown whether a person had a learning disability or autism spectrum disorder. So again, we've got quite an incomplete picture. And finally, again, if you're familiar with the sector, the Learning Disabilities Mortalities Review, which is run out of the University of Bristol, also was continuing to gather data. They gather data generally about mortality rates for people with learning disabilities. But a key limitation with that particular set of data that's been recognised for a long time is that it's only voluntary for anybody to report the death of an individual with a learning disability to the University of Bristol. Generally, that's done perhaps by the care setting or a doctor or a family member, but it's understood that that's an incomplete picture and there's considerable underreporting. So what we've got is a patchwork of different sources of information about mortality for this cohort in the context of the pandemic, all of which have shortcomings. And it's quite striking, I think, that when you come to think about sort of the data that we have that kind of cuts along other lines, whether that be ethnicity, whether that be age, we've got data that's a lot firmer and more reliable. And I think that has impact when we come to consider vaccination prioritisation, as I'll explain in a second. So as I say here, just a summary from the report itself, which acknowledges the limitations. Significantly, aside from limitations in relation to the picture of deaths among people with learning disabilities, we also don't have any solid source of data around test results, hospital admissions, or intensive care for people with learning disabilities. So we're functioning a little bit in a vacuum, and it's hard to see how the government can put in place policy that adequately prioritises the needs of this vulnerable cohort without this information being gathered properly. So, vaccination prioritisation, and how does this link in? So we've got the vaccine now, or at least one of them rolling out fairly soon. And obviously a question, given the limited number of stocks coming in, is who should get that vaccine first? You might have recalled that at the very beginning of the pandemic, there was a lot of discussion about whether there would need to be a clear framework for prioritisation of treatment. For example, if intensive care units got overwhelmed, how you would prioritise the needs of various individuals in receiving what might be a limited source of care. And it was in that context that we saw the really egregious use of blanket do not attempt resuscitation orders by some care homes, for example, who thought that this was a way of keeping pressure off intensive care units should they become overwhelmed. So here again, we meet this difficult topic of prioritisation of healthcare. And we again have concerns about the particular vulnerability of people with learning disabilities to not receiving care or not being able to access care. And also we know now from the limited data that we have that they are particularly vulnerable to death from COVID-19. So in September, the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation, and this is a statutory advisory body that's set up to advise the government about how to approach immunisation, they published interim advice. And this was really concerning because it essentially prioritised entirely on the basis of age, with only a couple of additional cohorts who were given priority, and those were people in care homes, and care home health and social care workers were quite high on the prioritisation list. But otherwise, prioritisation was entirely on the basis of age, without any consideration of any other form of vulnerability. And so obviously that was criticised for failing to recognise the vulnerabilities of a range of groups, including individuals with learning disabilities. And again, I think I highlighted it earlier as to the sort of significance of the age breakdown when we think about people with learning disabilities, because as I highlighted earlier, every group of adults with learning disabilities aged 35 years and up have a higher rate of death per 100,000 people than people aged 65 to 74. So the way it was set up was that basically if you were over 75, you were prioritised. Then if you were 65 to 74, you were prioritised. And so it went. But this didn't make any sense when we know that everyone with a learning disability who's over 35 has a higher vulnerability than the 65 to 74 age cohort of the general population who were prioritised. And so obviously there were rumblings around the potential for a legal challenge to this on the basis that it was discriminatory. If that was through a human rights framework, that would be Flynn-Moss discrimination, which is you're treating everyone equally in a way where this is a particular cohort who, because of their special circumstances, ought to be being treated differently. So there should be a different approach taken to people with learning disabilities in order to produce a more equal outcome. And again, this was just the chart I showed you earlier to show why the age breakdown really is a really poor way of mapping onto the rates of mortality for people with learning disabilities. So just after we'd actually started promoting this talk, the vaccination advice was updated, and that was on the 2nd of December 2020. And this looks a little bit more promising, but still isn't quite there when we think again about those figures that we had about mortality rates for learning disability at those different age ranges. So this is the current advice in terms of breakdown, and you probably have seen in the news that there are big question marks actually about whether that first priority group will receive priority because of difficulties in transferring stocks of the vaccine to care homes, which are smaller facilities, and concerns about being able to store the vaccine at appropriate temperatures. But nevertheless, what we do see is that there is, for the first time, some recognition of the vulnerability of people with learning disabilities, although they're still falling down at 6th prioritization on the list. And we've got this concept of severe and profound learning disability, which is nowhere defined. So a couple of concerns about this, obviously. It is still the case that this cohort is being prioritized behind groups that have lower mortality rates. So anyone who's 65 years and over, anyone who's 70 years and over but hasn't yet hit 75 will have a lower mortality rate in relation to COVID than somebody with a learning disability on the basis of the statistics we have. So why are they lower in prioritization? And if we think about the number of doses that we have coming in and the fact that each rollout is going to take time, that difference in prioritization could be quite significant in terms of the time that a person is able to access a vaccine and the protection that they are then afforded. We also have questions, obviously, about the meaning of severe and profound learning disability and who's going to decide who within that cohort of learning disabled people qualifies. So the data we had refers to learning disability generally rather than qualifying it in this kind of way. So how do they justify this approach? I think the other thing that you would note is that there's no other nuance. For example, there's no prioritization of BAME individuals or of men, despite there being clear evidence that they are more disadvantaged or more vulnerable to the virus. So this is a sort of an excerpt from the annex to the vaccine prioritization advice, setting out some of the general approach to rationalizing the prioritization framework that's been adopted. So they're basing this on a combination of scientific evidence, ethics in a general term, and deliverability. So the starting point is the evidence that we've been looking at, which is about relative mortality rates for different population groups, and that should underpin prioritization decisions. But if that were the case, you would expect that framework to look a little bit different. So how is it that we are nevertheless still deprioritizing people with learning disabilities despite the scientific data that we have, which would suggest they should be higher up that list? I think a key part of this is about this final concern about deliverability. So basically, they've said a simple age-based approach is easier in terms of delivery. And one of the reasons that they've used to justify, for example, leaving a breakdown by ethnicity out of the picture is that there's incomplete and inaccurate data. It can be difficult to identify eligible people where there's incomplete and inaccurate data, and therefore that would reduce transparency, public confidence, and slow the pace of vaccine rollout. And this is where I think the gaps in the data that I highlighted earlier and the poor recording just generally of medical records of whether somebody is learning disabled comes back into the picture. So right at the beginning of the pandemic, when we were sending those pre-action protocol letters on behalf of Every Death Counts, one of the responses we're getting back was we couldn't possibly do better, and it's not discriminatory because we simply don't hold data about this, which is a little bit chicken and egg. It's sort of the government saying we can't do any better because our current systems are inadequate, therefore we're not discriminating, sort of question mark about that. But I think again, at the end here of this just brief presentation, we're seeing the justification in part of the prioritization framework in terms of, well, if we don't hold complete data about a particular cohort, it will be difficult to operationalize prioritizing them, and therefore we can't do that. And so I think, again, this highlights a real problem in terms of the ongoing protection and advancement of the interests of people with learning disabilities during this pandemic, which is, while it remains the case that there are significant gaps in data gathered around health outcomes, around COVID testing, all of these things, we're going to have a really difficult time having the government develop policies that actually adequately prioritise the needs of people with learning disabilities. In terms of sort of where to from here, I think when I first was thinking about this presentation and it was first promoted, it was fairly clear that the first version of the prioritization framework, which didn't provide any carve out or any kind of position in that prioritisation specifically for people with learning disabilities could be legally challenged on the basis that it was discriminatory not to make special provision for this cohort who are particularly vulnerable, and probably on the basis, amongst other things, of a failure to discharge the public sector equality duty in formulating that prioritisation, as well as potentially other human rights grounds. I think the question now is that we've got a more nuanced prioritisation framework. Is it obviously that the more nuance is added and the more sort of justification and rationale is given by the specialist body to say, oh, well, yes, we've got to have scientific evidence informing this, but also we've got to balance that against deliverability. It starts to be a little bit muddier and a little bit more difficult potentially in the judicial review context to argue that the approach taken is straightforwardly discriminatory, or that there's been a breach of the public sector equality duty. I imagine that what might happen would be the government would say, well, we've considered the vulnerability of this cohort, we've catered for it in this way, and the reason that it's not sort of further catered for is because of deliverability issues, and a court might smile and nod at that. Nevertheless, I do have concerns that there's still a gap between the data that we do have, limited as it is, and the approach taken in terms of vaccination prioritisation. It still doesn't really make a lot of sense for people with learning disabilities to be sort of as far down in the ranking as they are rather than further up. And so I do think there is an onus on the government to justify that and to show that that what I think is essentially discriminatory treatment is a reasonable and justifiable means of sort of achieving at the end of something that can be effectively rolled out as a vaccination program. So I would say I think there's still merit on potentially pushing the government on this and saying, you know, this on its face doesn't make sense, and seeing if just even the sending of a pre-action protocol letter might lead to more shake-up, as we've seen in multiple areas during the pandemic. So I think some of what Oliver will come on to talk about in terms of measures around care homes and visiting, and what we've seen previously in terms of government shifts in response to lockdown provision is that generally if you send a pre-action protocol letter and point out, look, this doesn't adequately cater for the rights of people with disability, there has been some success during the pandemic in having those frameworks reassessed and reviewed, and carve-outs put in place for people with disabilities to ensure their needs are met. So this vaccination prioritisation framework might be another avenue where it's worth pushing again on the government and just seeing if we can get something that more adequately reflects the needs and the interests of people with learning disabilities in the context of this pandemic. So I think I'll stop sharing my screen now, and hopefully that's been successful, and hand over to Oliver, who will be talking about care homes, which are obviously a really significant context for people with disabilities during the pandemic. Thanks.
So thanks so much, Alice. I thought that was really interesting and I learnt a lot. I'm going to be speaking about visits to care homes and taking people out of care homes. And before I start, I just wanted to express my condolences to the multiple thousands of families who have lost loved ones to COVID-19, especially those in care home settings, and send my solidarity to families who haven't been able to see their loved ones for many weeks or months, and send my thoughts to those in care homes who've been denied the right to see their friends and family. I want to come to the very recent government guidance on care home visits. But before that, I want to just make a couple of points. The first is from science and social science, the second one from the Court of Protection, and then the third one from the TIA regulations. So my starting point is that there's an imperative to secure visits to people in care homes because of the importance not just of seeing someone else, but the importance of touch. And many studies have been carried out. This is just one example which looked at several different research papers and suggested that touch improves people's health status, and in particular the psychological welfare and health status of people with cognitive disabilities. and people who are institutionalized, and institutions include care homes. So this isn't just a technical Article 8 legal thing. It's about securing what comes naturally to people, and that's consensual touch. Secondly, a very long paragraph from the Court of Protection. This is a case which Mr. Justice Hayden, the Vice President of the Court of Protection, dealt with just a couple of weeks ago. And essentially he is saying in this long paragraph that there are countervailing considerations. On one hand, the risk of infection and death, and on the other hand, the risk of corroding the quality of life of people in care homes by denying them the rights. And he said that, I've just highlighted this part here, the obligation to protect the rights of the individual, particularly the vulnerable and mentally incapacitated, is not diminished because of COVID-19. And he goes on to say, and I'll just read this out because I think it's quite important, that the time has come for care homes to position themselves in the vanguard of the developing opportunities. In other words, they should move from the front line and be careful not to lag behind, move to the front line, sorry, and be careful not to lag behind when identifying the emerging options. There are many reasons why this must not be the case, not least the fact that, whilst this may not apply to Mrs. Davis, who was the person concerned in that case, for many in the care home system, time is simply not on their side. So that's what the Court of Protection has said, really an emphasis to facilitate visits there. And the current regulations that set out the 3 tiers that we're all living under now, that came into force on the 2nd of December, provide for an exception to the general prohibition not to leave your home. So you can leave your home for many different purposes, and one of them is for visiting a person who is staying in a hospice or a care home, if you are a member of their household, a close family member, or a friend. And so now we turn to the government guidance on care home visits, which was updated on the 1st of December. And here there's really a change of emphasis, a change of default, whereas previously in the pandemic, the default was, look, the virus spreads like wildfire in institutional settings, so visits have been cancelled. Whereas now the default is that care homes should seek to enable visits where the visitor has been tested and where that test has returned a negative result, and to facilitate outdoor visiting and screened visits. And so the default now, as the guidance says, is that visits should be supported and enabled wherever it is safe to do so. But the guidance makes very clear that in any situation where there's an outbreak in the care home, then visits should be cancelled. And the guidance sets out this balancing that Mr. Justice Hayden identified. So on the one hand, the benefit of visiting, of well-being and quality of life, and I would say of close human contact and touch, and of course weighed against the risk of transmission of the virus to staff and residents. So why is there this change of emphasis? Well, that's down to lateral flow testing. So this is the new test where you can get the results within about 30 minutes. And so the government has said that there will be sufficient quantities of lateral flow tests within care homes to enable 2 visitors to visit each resident by Christmas. And the guidance says that, look, if a visitor has a negative test and has the garb on, the PPE, and if they follow infection prevention and control measures like sneezing into a tissue and rubbing your hands with sludgy antibacterial juice, then it may be possible for visitors to have physical contact with their loved one, such as providing personal care, but I think most importantly, holding hands and a hug. Although contact should be limited to reduce the risk of transmission, which will generally be increased by very close contact. So that all sounds great, And indeed, it is fantastic news. It's a real change of direction by the government. But of course, as one might expect, there are significant problems. And so the BMJ reported on the lateral flow test, and one that we have in this country is by what's called Innova. And basically, the top experts say that the test may miss as many as half COVID-19 cases. And so while the overall sensitivity of the test is around 77%, that rose to over 95% with people with high viral loads. So overall, very good, but this evaluation by these experts found that when the test was performed by laboratory scientists, you could get that high level of sensitivity, but it dropped to about 73% when administered by trained healthcare staff, and dropped to 58% if it was administered by self-trained members of the public. And so there's an interval range but beneath and above the 58%. That's why it's around half. So that's not great. And the professor of biostatistics, John Deeks in Birmingham, who was leading this study in the Cochrane collaboration, said that the Innova lateral test is certainly not fit for purpose. So that is hardly a ringing endorsement of the government's plan. And what happened then is that very rapidly we saw several local authorities basically saying to the care homes in their patch not to use these tests because, contrary to what the government have said, they don't work very well. And so that's it's not just Greater Manchester that did that. As far as I could tell, there are several other big local authorities like Sheffield, Rochdale, and others. And a few of the care home providers, most notably Barchester Care Homes, has basically said that within their care homes, they're not going to rely on this lateral flow test, and that their visitors, unfortunately, will continue to use the COVID secure visiting suites, which we'll come on to. So guidance, the sort of about turn in the guidance is based on the availability and the rollout of this test. But then at the grassroots level, we can see that there's significant doubt, and that's jeopardized the uptake. So back to the guidance, as I've said, that if there is an outbreak in a care home, so an outbreak means if a resident or staff person tests positive, then visits have to stop immediately. And there's an exception to that, which is for exceptional circumstances. And that includes end of life. But I would say that end of life surely can't be the only exceptional circumstance. And it would very much depend on the nature of the outbreak, the kind of setup of the care home, and the circumstance of the resident in question. The guidance encourages outdoor visits. Well, that sounded great a few months ago in the summer, but I'm not sure how this is going to be possible in winter. And with an outdoor visit, the visitor doesn't need a test, and they have to perform social distancing. They have to maintain a 2-meter distance between them and their loved one. And I know that for many residents with dementia or a resident with a learning disability or potentially autism, that is going to be very difficult to keep 2 meters apart. So other innovations that we've seen springing up in care homes recently have been these visiting suites, or colloquially called pods, visiting pods. So here's an example from a care home in Stapen Hill. Looks like a country fair. Here's an example from a care home in Oxfordshire. Basically, they've put a partition in down the side of, or in the middle of one room, and most of the partition is glass or perspex. And as you can see there are microphones and loudspeakers on either side. This certainly reminds me of sort of prison visits. And I know from speaking to many families that it's good because you can see people, but this doesn't replace a real visit. And here's another example, just another way of doing it. So here's a care home which has sort of put up double doors. Actually, the door is a single door, but then next to it there's a sheet of glass. And so, yeah, the idea is that the airflow is different on both sides of the glass, and that the visitor doesn't actually come into contact with the resident there. And so, you know, pods seem like a good idea. And in fact, over the last couple of months, there's been a little sort of cottage industry of firms who have decided that they're going to go into the care home visiting pod business. So that's one company which is selling its pods. And then you may appreciate the pun here, the care home. And now you can buy the care dome. Order yours today. So I imagine that we'll be seeing more of these. And I imagine that despite the good intentions of the rollout of the vaccine, that these will be still in existence as we move into spring and summer. So the guidance sets out further tips for visitors, saying that essentially, I mean, it's very poignant in a way that the government is now saying, after many months of inaction, that essentially, look, care homes have a duty to talk to residents about the possibility that their loved one with dementia, for example, may not be able to recognize them because they haven't been there for so long, because they've been not allowed to go there. So the guidance says, remind residents to speak loudly and clearly, and ask visitors to speak loudly and clearly, and remind visitors, please, not to wear a hat. So that just increases the chances that the resident can recognize the visitor, which I think is probably very good advice, but incredibly sad that it has to be said. What about people who lack capacity? Well, the guidance is pretty interesting on this point. And for those who are interested in the Mental Capacity Act world, the guidance says that the question is about whether the resident has capacity to consent to a provider's visiting policy, which is an interesting way of putting it. So does that mean that a separate capacity assessment needs to take place, or is consenting to the provider's visiting policy a subset of a decision about care arrangements, or is it indeed connected with contact arrangements? So for those who lack capacity to make that decision, then a best interest decision under the Mental Capacity Act will need to be made. And as is well known, the family's view must be taken into account under the Act. And of course, if there's a disagreement, and the guidance doesn't say this, but if there is a disagreement about where best interests lie in relation to anything, including visiting people in care homes, then any party can make an application to the Court of Protection for resolution. So the status of the guidance is quite important. It's just guidance, it's non-statutory guidance. And it says that any policy that a care home adopts must, of course, comply with the Human Rights Act and the Equality Act, which Alice has been talking about a lot. And the guidance is not written for residents in care homes or for people wanting to visit, but it's actually written for care homes. So for the purpose, it says, of supporting local system leaders, providers, staff and families. I would say it's written mostly for care homes, because the obligation under the guidance is to ensure that there is a written policy at every care home. And against that policy, care homes must take decisions in relation to each individual resident. And each of those decisions, the guidance says, should involve the resident, their family and friends. And each of those decisions should be based on a dynamic risk assessment, which sounds ever so sort of dynamic. But what that means is that the risk assessment, the dynamism of the risk assessment comes from the fact that the residents and the resident situation might change, but also the external COVID environment would change. And care homes have to make decisions having spoken to and received the advice of the local public health officials. So that's all I wanted to say about visits to care homes. I just want to say a few words about this window of opportunity to form a Christmas bubble from the 23rd to the 27th of December. And so this applies to people in care homes as well. So a visit out or a trip out of the care home can only happen with the agreement of the care home, and one needs an individual risk assessment. And the risk assessment needs to be agreed with the resident, or if they lack capacity, a best interest decision needs to be taken. The risk assessment needs to be sort of tethered to the care plan as a whole. And the guidance says that within the risk assessment, there are 4 essential things that need to be considered. So under the heading of nature of the plan visit, that would include the intended activities where the resident will be spending time, dinner, pulling crackers, that sort of thing. Some type of visits are inherently safer, the guidance says, such as visiting outdoor or well-ventilated spaces. Some are inherently riskier, it goes on to say, such as indoor public spaces where other people will be present and should be avoided. And you can see there that other considerations need to be weighed in the balance, such as the person's support needs. How will the care and support be provided at home? How will infection prevention and control measures be put into place? And how will the resident get to and from wherever it is that they're going? And I'm assuming that most people will want to spend time at their family home or a family's home. And importantly here, a resident from a care home is only allowed to mix with people from one household. So this is really important, right? So if my grandmother lives in a care home and the plan is that we all go to my parents' house for Christmas dinner, that can't happen, because that would be a 3-household Christmas, because there's me, my parents, and my grandmother. So this is going to cause considerable anxiety and distress, I think, for many families, because it's not possible for a resident of a care home to be a member of the 3-part family unit at Christmas time. So my grandmother would be able to visit either my household or my parents' household, but they can't switch and they can't be a member of a 3-household Christmas bubble. So what would need to happen is that they get a lateral flow device test before the visit. Note my comments about the skepticism around the accuracy of those tests. If there's a positive result, then the visit is cancelled and the resident should have a proper PCR test. If it's negative and the trip takes place, then you may smile at this, that the advice is to maintain social distancing in the family home, to ensure that the person washes their hands regularly, that fresh air should be let into the rooms, and the guidance says that the residents and their families should consider wearing a face covering. And upon return to the care home, the person needs to isolate for 14 days. And if they develop symptoms, then they would need further tests. And if they have no symptoms after 14 days, they can return to mingling in the general care home community. Now, this is of considerable concern to thousands of families up and down the country, because there are many people with dementia, with learning disabilities or autism, who would find it extremely difficult, if not impossible, to spend 2 weeks inside their care home bedroom. And if that's the case, then that will mean that they can't take the Christmas trip, because they simply won't be able to isolate for 14 days. And so I've had conversations with several people over the last few days about Equality Act points that what exactly is the purpose of the isolation for 14 days? Are there any other more proportionate means of achieving whatever it is that the legitimate aim would be? So presumably it's to stop spread of asymptomatic COVID. So what about doing a test every day? What about not isolating in the bedroom, but allocating another room where someone could spend their time? Or what about if there are 2 or 3 people who may know each other, that they could form a sort of isolation bubble, returning home to the care home, so that they wouldn't have to spend 14 days in their own bedrooms. And so I won't go into the technical details of the Equality Act, because Alice has already done so, but there might well be arguments, in my view, that if applied in a blanket way, that 14-day isolation requirement might well be unlawful. Finally, on the guidance, I just wanted to flag supported living accommodation. That is separate guidance which was updated recently. There's no general exception, remember, to leave your house to visit someone in supported living accommodation, only to hospitals, care homes and hospices. So if you want to visit someone, if you're in a tier 2 or tier 3 area, then you would have to form a bubble with that person. And that would require either you or them to be in a single adult household. So that's tough for many people. So finally, what to do if you're not getting visits to your loved ones in a care home, or you are being prevented from taking your loved one out over Christmas? Well, the first thing to do is obtain the care home's written policy and make sure that it's in line with the government guidance. I think these types of situations are best solved by being really creative and innovative. So suggest ways for COVID-safe visits or the COVID-safe Christmas trip to take place. There are many resources now. I just wanted to flag 4 charities that are doing amazing work helping families to meet with their loved ones. So Challenging Behaviour Foundation, I would recommend turning to if your loved one has a learning disability or autism. Hourglass is a fantastic organisation helping older people and focusing on abuse and exploitation of older people. And they've really picked up on this issue. Access Social Care is a new charity providing assistance to people in social care. And then I and others, including Kirsty Stewart of Irwin Mitchell, were involved in helping several people with learning disabilities and autism and their families come up with some easy read guidance on righttovisit.info, which we probably need to update given the new government guidance. If that fails, I would recommend you consult with a specialist solicitor or a direct access barrister. In my experience, a carefully worded letter can cause care homes and local authorities to change their minds. And I've also seen media and social media being used very successfully. So just to summarize, the good news is that the default has changed. Every care home needs to have a written policy that complies with the government guidance. Lateral flow tests and PPE seem to be the answer to boosting visits, but note the problems around the tests. I would encourage people to challenge in a polite and robust way any refusal to allow visits to take place. And I would also urge people, if you are thinking about this, to organise your end of December trip out of the care home well in advance to make sure that difficulties can be resolved. Thank you.
Jamie, I think you were muted.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Alice and Oliver. Two incredibly clear and helpful presentations. Alice, discussing statistics in the way that you did is always philosophical in my book, so thank you for that. There are some questions available in the chat, but I just wanted to say first and foremost, thank you so much for providing such a useful presentation and also a strong indication of how the law and lawyers can help. In fact, at one point, Alice, I thought you were going to suggest that the mere fact we had a seminar on this produced some kind of change in the relevant guidance or law, which would have been interesting. The questions have come in a certain order, and I'm going to essentially ask them in that order, if that's okay. And the first one then I think is directed really to you, Oliver, because it concerns the guidance and visits. And the question from Susanna Penk is, if a family like ours has more than 2 children, can we get our own tests to enable all 4 of us to visit? As opposed to, I think, the guidance indication that only 2 people can visit.
Yeah, that's a really great question. I mean, it seems incredibly arbitrary, doesn't it? Let's say that there's a grandparent in a care home, and then the government comes along and says, you can only have 2 people visit you, whereas they may have a large family member who, used to visit pre-COVID. That's what the guidance says, up to 2 people. And I think that to get around that, you would have to argue that for this particular person, these particular people are really important. Or that you might want to suggest, because I think the point of it is that care homes don't want 10 people visiting, because that just increases the risk by 5-fold compared with 2, right? So you might want to say, okay, well, for a certain month, can these 2 people be the assigned visitors? And then in the next month or next week, these other 2 people from the family can be assigned visitors. I think it's about coming up with practical suggestions that make it easy for the care home to say yes. So to sort of, respect what the government guidance has said, but to come up with practical alternatives.
So the fact that they were able to access their own tests, which they were able to demonstrate, indicated that they didn't have COVID-19 wouldn't necessarily make a great difference in your view?
Well, I don't think it's about that, because then the reason would be about the availability and the rollout of tests. I get the impression that it's not about that. It's about limiting the number of people who are visiting each resident. But you can make the argument, and then, well, what are you doing? I mean, could you, for example, offer to essentially shield for a week before all 4 of you would visit? Or could you arrange to visit your loved one outside or something like that?
Great, thank you very much. Alice, Lorena Horton has a question that is sensibly for both of you, but I think, Alice, you may be well posed to answer it. She says this, is there some means of supporting or fighting for non-older adults who live in care homes and supported living being moved up the priority list for vaccines? And I think I also noticed that the prioritisation list very much had care homes at the top, but it was very much care homes for older people. And so that question from Lorena Horton does seem to raise a possible way of shifting those priorities around.
Certainly, I think there are two things here that need flagging. I think I very, very briefly said that although the official guidance that's been put out in relation to prioritisation put care homes at the top, that there have been some news reports about the difficulties of that suggest that they're not actually going to be prioritised for anyone. And that's because currently the vaccine that's first being rolled out has to be stored at incredibly low temperatures, and it's packed in these units which hold a high number of doses with particular cooling packs sort of technology in there. But it means once you open them that you start to lose that cooling. And if you have care homes that are dotted around at various different places with a small number of people, there are questions logistically about whether you can manage to do that vaccination in a way that doesn't lead to wastage because of the loss of some doses when they go below a certain temperature after a certain period of time. And there's some real controversy around that, because Boris Johnson has been saying, well, we can't do this in England yet, and we have to wait for certain sign off for certain new protocols that haven't yet been approved, but Scotland don't seem to have a problem with it. So you can see already that there's some fuss being kicked up about whether care homes will be prioritised despite the framework I set out. So that's one hurdle. In terms of your more specific question about care homes with non-older adults, because it does focus on older adults, I think it might be a little bit difficult to separate out the argument for people with learning disabilities generally being higher up the list from the argument for people with learning disabilities in care homes. And the reason I say this is that one aspect of that Public Health England report was to look at whether any particular settings that people with learning disabilities were in had led to greater mortality rates and vulnerabilities. And they did actually find that care homes that had people with learning disabilities in them didn't tend to experience a high level of outbreak in the same way as care homes with older people in them. And I think that's possibly the underpinning of the distinction that's being drawn, which might make it a little bit difficult to challenge legally, because I think there is an evidential basis for saying, well, there's a good reason to treat some care homes differently than others. And the sort of working theory as to why care homes with people with learning disabilities and then might have been less vulnerable to COVID outbreaks is because they tend to have smaller numbers of beds and so on, is my understanding. So, I mean, I think it's certainly something that it is an interesting avenue to look at, but I do think it would probably be a stronger strategy just to focus on shifting the whole cohort of individuals with learning disabilities higher up that prioritisation ranking rather than specifically those who are also in care homes.
Thank you very much. Very clear answer. The next question comes from somebody who hasn't given the name, but I don't think that's in any way connected to the nature of the question. But it effectively asks this, and perhaps this is one you could answer, Oliver. It's all very well having an exception to the two-person rule in relation to care home visits for people who can have visits take place outdoors. But what about those people who can't do that for mobility reasons or something else? How is there an exception for them, or how is there some other way of opening up the possibility of more visits for those people? As opposed to those who can access some form of outdoor pod or some of the examples that you showed us.
Yeah, thanks. So is this in relation to more than two people wanting to visit?
Well, I suppose it is. It's because the principal exception seemed to be, well, you can do it outside even if you haven't had tests, and obviously you maintain social distancing. And you gave a number of examples of that where sort of ingenious solutions have been created despite the winter weather. But of course, none of those solutions would apparently or seemingly help those who have mobility issues that would prevent them from getting outside in the first place. That seems to be the gist of the question. Exactly.
But the government, the guidance does say that outdoor visits will be, not possible for some people. And I guess guidance can't say anything more than that. It will be down to the care home and the families to figure out whether, okay, well, what is preventing someone from being supported to do an outdoor visit? Does it depend on the temperature on that particular day? Does it depend on sort of step and ramp access or whatever it might be? But otherwise, the government said, the guidance says that two people can visit, right? If they have negative tests. So I think that's the main message. That's the thing to focus on, which is the positive change.
I suppose one thing might be about the status of this guidance and the extent to which it is only guidance directed to care homes, as you've mentioned. So what scope might there be for bringing a challenge against a care home that doesn't, in a proper case, disregard or in some way act inconsistently with the guidance because of the special circumstances presented by a particular family, like the family with the 4 children, for example? What would the kind of nature of a legal challenge look like in that respect?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I suppose the sort of the cases that I've been involved with have all been resolved at the local level. And we've always brought in the local authority and said, hey, local authority, you have positive obligations to facilitate contact in a safe and COVID safe way between this family and this resident. And that's done the trick. But yeah, you would have to sort of find either an age-related or disability-related point to argue an Inequality Act point. And then there's regular Article 8 Human Rights Act arguments, of course, that the state has positive obligations to facilitate contact between people. But I guess it would be very difficult to pin all hopes on Article 8 because, of course, the easy defense is the government says, well, yes, that's exactly what we're doing. And we're doing it in a COVID safe way, but we are encouraging and facilitating access by promulgating this guidance that places obligations on care homes to facilitate these sorts of visits.
And the care homes, of course, too, might be public authorities under the Human Rights Act, and therefore would have distinct obligations to respond to the individual circumstances. Thank you very much. The next question is certainly for you, Alice. It comes from Chris Hatton. I think you may already know what the question is because it came into the chat function. But I think in essence, it's testing this proposition from the government that it would be, or at least would pose problems around deliverability if we were to prioritise people with learning difficulties because of the absence of proper information, in particular information held by GPs and such like. Do you have any comments to make about Chris's question?
Yeah, I absolutely do. So the first thing I should say actually is if you're interested in this area, Chris Hatton's blog is excellent, and you should be following it for all of sort of the breakdown of up-to-date data concerning the impact of COVID and other things on people with learning disabilities. I think, Chris, that you're absolutely right. To the extent that the government, when they are seeking to justify the current framework, say that deliverability is key and therefore where it's difficult to identify cohorts that would stand in the way of easy rollout, they do sort of contradict themselves a little because, as you've identified, the prioritisation framework currently includes people who are clinically extremely vulnerable, and so you have to go through and identify if people have got Down syndrome or if they've got other specific health conditions. And then we've got this amorphous test that I've referred to, which is this idea of severe and profound learning disabilities, which, as I say, I don't know what that means when somebody will have a severe and profound learning disability. And so it does seem that the prioritisation regime that they've introduced itself already has difficult to identify cohorts in it. And I would have thought that these cohorts might be more difficult to identify, for example, than people along ethnicity lines. So I sort of don't understand how this rationale is playing out for leaving out any kind of reference to BME or any of these issues. The proposal that you've made, which I think is an excellent one, is to look for those who are registered with GPs as having learning disabilities, which is about 250,000 people. And it would seem that you've got there a register, clearly defined cohort that you could target. And it's also not a particularly high number of people. So if you were to put them further up that prioritisation chart, it wouldn't lead to a massive hiccup or a delay in time getting to the next sort of age cohort that you were concerned about. So I do think that would be an excellent and practical way forward that would be consistent with the kind of principles identified by the government, which, as I say, frankly, I find the kind of rationale tagged onto the prioritisation framework a little difficult to follow and at points inconsistent. The one query I would have is, and I'm sure that you're more across this than I am, Chris, is that, you know, we know that a lot of people aren't necessarily registered with their GPs. So I would still have, as having learning disabilities, so I would still have concerns about how do we address that additional kind of group of people who are still vulnerable, but nevertheless aren't on that registration list. But certainly it would be an incredibly good start if we could get that 250,000 people further up that prioritisation and getting that vaccine earlier.
Great, thank you very much. I'm just looking now at next question, and this one comes from Emily Gent. I'm not quite sure who it's directed towards. It could be either of you, perhaps, most likely Oliver, but would you mind revisiting supported living and whether those settings are within scope of Christmas bubbles? By revisiting, I'm not quite sure I know what Emily means, but I think it's directed towards whether or not people who are in supported living accommodation units can form part of the three bubbles, perhaps?
Yeah, they can. And so if I put in the chat, I'll just put in the chat the generic Christmas bubble, call it Christmas bubble. There you go. So that's the generic Christmas bubble guidance. And it makes no mention of supported living accommodation. And there's no general exception to visiting someone in supported living in terms of the overall coronavirus regulations. So someone who lives in supported living is treated as a sort of ordinary member of the public when forming the 3 household Christmas bubble. So that situation is unlike a care home resident who is prohibited from joining a 3 household Christmas bubble and can only join a 1 household Christmas bubble.
Thank you very much, Oliver. That was very clear. Just looking through the list of questions. At the moment, there aren't any that haven't been answered as far as I can see. Does anybody else have any more questions for Alice or Oliver about their very clear presentations? Or indeed anything more generally about disabled people and the pandemic, or any particular legal issues you would like their opinion or view on in that context? Just going to give people a minute or two. I mean, while we're just waiting, Alice, I mean, I was very curious about the rationale that the government have put forward for this very simple, as they describe it, process of prioritisation. And I just wonder, with my slightly more cynical hat on, whether or not the reluctance on the government's part to have a different system of prioritisation that maybe reflected some of the things we now know about the impact of the pandemic, whether on disabled people or, for example, on BAME people, has anything to do with the government not really wishing to publicly recognise in a very obvious way that the pandemic has impacted in that way on the country's population. Perhaps they consider it to be too contentious, too controversial. Perhaps they think it's going to reflect badly on them and the way they've handled the crisis. Do you think there's anything of that in it, or am I being unduly critical?
I think there's certainly threads of that. So I should be clear about the justification document, which is available up online, sort of the explanation document. Talks in general terms about the need for rollout. So there's not a specific connection, as I say, made between gaps in data and the learning disability cohort specifically, but they make the general point about gaps in data. But when it comes to sort of some of the more probably politically sensitive points like BAME or like gender prioritisation, they do say sort of odd things like, well, this might have an unintended negative effect. So this might lead to greater stigmatisation of certain communities, or you know, unpredicted unintended effects, which I think, I don't know what I think about that. I do wonder if they are trying to find a way to dodge what would be an obvious point to prioritise certain portions of our community who've been disproportionately impacted. They do say, well, some of our priorities will capture that because, you know, there's a certain high proportion of people working in certain kind of jobs that are in our priority categorizations and so on. But I do think they kind of fudge it. And I do wonder if it's because of sensitivity, because can you imagine, I feel like something like a learning disability, people might not knee jerk quite so strongly against, but if we had a prioritisation regime that put Black men first, for example, rather than just granny, I do think that would be something people would react very strongly to, despite the very firm data. So I do think they do attempt to fudge it by referring in more general terms to potential stigmatisation of certain communities and so on. But yeah, I think you possibly have reason to be slightly cynical about.
I mean, I partly ask it because in other contexts and in other cases, we certainly see the government respond in that way, where it's suggested there is telemnos discrimination, i.e. where there's a failure to, as it were, positively treat a certain group differently and in a better way than other groups. And the government seems very reluctant about that.
Yes.
And worries about public perceptions. If the public can't understand that you're still trying to correct existing injustices and level the playing field rather than trying to advantage particular groups. So I was just curious about that. I mean, one can see the argument about simplicity works to some extent, but perhaps not quite so far as to only have one metric at all, which is obviously age. And in relation to things like the disproportionate impact on the BAME community, we're starting to understand more about why that might be so, and it may have to do with the particular vocations people are disproportionately represented in, and the extent to which that brings them into contact with people who might be infected and things. And that's another interesting feature, isn't it, that there's no reference at all to the sorts of scenarios and jobs and vocations people are engaged in, other than care homes, of course, feeding into that prioritisation system that one might have seen a bit more of.
Yeah, so they do consider the possibility of occupational risk again, but they consider this again to be, the difficulty of singling out a particular, I'm just looking at it now to make sure I'm being accurate, but sort of singling out a particular cohort, again, might be stigmatizing or could deny them of opportunities. I think, as I say, it's kind of fudged again to the extent they start looking at these kind of strands that you think would have been natural for them to consider as aspects of prioritization. They sort of go, oh, it's a bit difficult, and then they frame it in language that seems sort of neutral and scientific. But I do find some of the internal reasoning somewhat difficult to follow, frankly.
Can I ask, in relation to this, that do we know how many weeks or months it's going to take to vaccinate everyone in group 1, then move on to group 2, then move on to group 3, etc.? Because it seems to me that unless one could argue that people with learning disabilities should be shifted into the clinically extremely vulnerable individuals group, then they'd only jump up to become, they're at number 6 right now, and they'd only jump up to become number 5.
Yeah, I do think I don't have specific timeframes in mind in terms of kind of the size of the particular cohorts, but I think if I can pull up the prioritization, I think we could push them ahead of, so basically in terms of age, they're only less vulnerable than people above 75. So you could skip the 65 plus and the 70 plus cohort, I think, and put them ahead of those. I guess there are question marks, as we say, about whether the care homes are going to stay in number 1 slot, given the potential practical difficulties around that. So it might be that it would have a practical impact, but I certainly think the fact that they're at 6 right now means it would be a very long time, given what we know about the size of the cohort's head. But I'd need to go through the particular figures. Yeah, I don't have that at my fingertips, Oliver, but yeah.
Thank you very much, Alice. Just a follow-up question for you from Lindsay Bampton, who says this, really asking for some advice. Which national networks, groups or associations, if any, are approaching the government relearning disability cohort vaccine prioritisation, and which ones would it be useful to have support from? So what kind of civil society responses are out there, and who can Lindsay approach to try and get some further advice and perhaps help them?
Certainly. I haven't seen a lot in the kind of non-legal sector. I know that Bindmans have put out a press release about the potential for a legal challenge to this, but that wasn't linked to any kind of particular intervener or any individual group who are pushing that. But I think if you go onto the Bindmans solicitors website and look at the press releases, there are details there. And I think if you were in touch with them, because I know that they were certainly looking for people to be in touch who had an interest in the area to build some momentum behind a potential legal challenge, then they may be able to point you in better directions. But I have to admit that I'm not aware of a broader discussion going on about that as of yet. I'm sure that there is stuff out there that I'm not aware of. So apologies, Lindsay.
Well, it's early days, which is why it's been particularly useful and illuminating to hear from you, Alice, about all of this. I have one question from Brian O'Shea, which is a little bit off topic, but he asks this, whether or not Oliver and Alice have any views about the conflict between providing disabled people access to specialist NHS provision, for example, specialist spinal cord centres, which are centrally commissioned through NHS Specialist Commissioning Services, and the need for the NHS to reduce hospital capacity in order to manage COVID-19 transmission.
I think this is really difficult. So, I mean, I'm not going to be able to give anything other than the most broad brush kind of response to that. But certainly at the beginning of the pandemic, I was involved in a potential legal challenge that didn't go ahead about prioritisation frameworks. And that was more about the prioritisation of intensive care units and how those kind of decisions are made and who makes them, because there was a concern basically that there was no coherent overarching framework providing guidance. So this was falling on the shoulders of specific doctors, which, is really difficult for them and quite problematic as well in a lot of ways. I think as the pandemic has evolved, we've understood that it's not just about access to immediate care for COVID that's important, it's the knock-on effect for all of these other essential health services that you've identified here, particularly in relation to spinal injury treatment that people require that's being lost because of COVID. So I do think, I think it would be very, very, very difficult to frame as a legal challenge, but I certainly think that there is something to be said for pushing again in the public domain, maybe in the form of some kind of campaign, for there to be again some kind of proper and open discussion about the trade-offs that are happening, because the government's general approach, and certainly when we were putting together that initial legal challenge, was no, nobody's being prioritised. It's all tickety-boo. But I don't think that's realistic at this point. We know that elective surgeries and so on are falling off the list, and none of those targets are being met. And I do think there is space to open a conversation and to say, yes, we need to prioritise treatment of COVID, but these are having significant life-changing effect on other people who are missing out on other treatment, and we need to start openly talking about how we balance those competing interests. I know that's not much more than rephrasing your question back to you and saying start a public conversation about it, but I'm afraid there's not much more to be said, and it was fairly difficult, I think, to frame a legal challenge of a failure to make a COVID-specific treatment framework. But to argue that there should be some other broader national framework across all areas, it's not really a legal, it's not really an easily mountable legal argument, but I think it's a really important issue.
Well, what strikes me, we're coming to the end now, more than anything else, is just how important all of this thinking and learning is that's being done, because whilst a lot of it may unfortunately be happening too late to help some people, I think there's a general sense or even consensus that this isn't going to be the last pandemic we see even in our lifetimes, and we obviously need to be much better prepared, both from a practical and a philosophical point of view, to deal with that pandemic when it comes and brings the challenges that it brings. I'm just going to double check that there are no more questions left here. No, just Brian O'Shea saying thank you very much. Miss Penk, who raised a very sad and difficult question about having 4 children, has raised a number of other questions. Miss Penk, I don't want you to feel that we're not answering them. It's just we need to be a bit careful about getting too involved in individual cases in a seminar like this. But can I really just urge you to make contact with us after today's session, and we'll do our very best to help you, whether that's the helping in the drafting of a letter to the care home or whatever, to try and address the problems. I can see from the nature of your questions that you're facing a very difficult situation, that one that must be causing both you and your mother a great deal of anxiety. And I hope you don't in any way think that we're not alive to that and don't share it. But I think the appropriate way to discuss the individual circumstances of that case may be outside of this forum. But I'm sure I can speak on behalf of both Alice and Oliver in saying that they very much welcome an opportunity to provide you with some help and advice with that. And we can see how urgent it is from the nature of your question. So I'm sure they will respond accordingly. So on that note, can I just say on behalf of everybody who's listening, Alice and Oliver, thank you very much. I know these presentations were put together at quite short notice and whilst you're struggling with your own busy workloads, but I think we as a collective audience all really got a great deal from that. It was extremely informative, very interesting, if still slightly maddening. And we look forward to seeing how things develop here on in, but undoubtedly it'll be better off with both of you helping disabled people than were it the case otherwise. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Jamie.
If I can just finally say thank you to everybody who's tuned in, and just a reminder that the panelists remain open for queries of the kind that I've just been talking about, but also the recording and the slides will be available for you all to look at and refresh your memories with, etc. after today. And I think, Oliver, you put in a couple of links up to the Q&A session as well, so the guidance and such like is there for people to see it. Okay, thank you very much, everybody. Have a good week and speak to you soon. Thank you.